Okay, option 3 then is the conservation and restoration of mangroves. This one is really about getting down and dirty, as you can see. Involves getting your hands and feet and your clothes full of mud. So if you really have some energy to expend, this is a good activity. Good for your physical exercise and also good for the environment. So increasingly important that we give mangroves a helping hand, and especially in areas where we are suffering from coastal erosion, it's a good place to target mangrove rehabilitation. They produce for us. So what are mangroves? Mangroves are really salt-tolerant trees that grow in intertidal zone in tropical, subtropical regions. And according to the World Bank, there's good evidence that in the right circumstances, mangroves can help to reduce vulnerability to climate-related coastal hazards. I think the main features of mangroves that make them so useful are the fact that they're salt-tolerant, so that they can grow in seawater, which is thereby providing a buffer between the wave energy and the land. And two, that that their roots are structurally diverse. And so they provide a physical barrier again to wave energy, and also they provide niches for various marine organisms to give them protection from predation. That's what makes mangroves really, really unique and important plants, and makes mangroves stands or swamps really important and biodiverse rich ecosystems. So they provide coastal protection, erosion control, the habitat nursery ground for fish and other marine organisms, support diversified livelihoods. They sequester and store carbon storage. This store carbon 10 times more efficiently, as I mentioned previously, and they perform a vital function in nutrient cycling. Here's a slide that really shows you the benefit of mangroves in terms of reducing wave energy. You see how that energy is totally attenuated or dissipated, leading to very calm water at the back of the mangrove stand. I'll show that to you again. This is a very powerful slide. It's a wave tank that was built, I think, by students, presented at an exposition somewhere. I encourage you to use this very powerful tool in your advocacy, in your PowerPoint presentations, because once people see this, you don't really need to explain it, because it's visually apparent. Okay, so this slide's just showing you some of the information that you need to be aware of when setting out to do mangrove restoration. The table on the left really gives you an idea of the different kinds of species that are found in Pacific Island countries. Amazing that Papua New Guinea has 31 species of mangrove. It's quite incredible. The mangroves are mostly found in the west of the region, so Melanesian countries, as you can see there, have a number of different species, and then also in the northern Pacific, the western lying countries have more species than those in the east. Same in the South Pacific. As you move further towards the east, the number of mangroves species drop off. So where you have a number of different mangrove species in your country, you need to be aware of their site requirements. Different species have a preference to grow in different parts of the foreshore, as can be seen from the diagram on the right. And it's important to understand this in the context of your particular country and planting site, to make sure that you choose the right species and you plant them in the right place. I guess the biggest threat to mangroves is clearance of large areas for infrastructure and commercial and industrial building purposes, as well as clearance of large areas for agricultural purposes. There are other threats, of course, such as the communities collecting wood for fuel and also wood for construction activity, which can be accommodated as long as it's done within sustainable limits. But it can be a problem where, just as with fishing and overfishing, where the rate of extraction is too high for the mangroves to withstand. 2 points I just wanted to make here is one that mangroves are increasingly under threat from development, because they're targeted by developers, particularly of warehouses or factories, etc., residential areas, because one, they are flat land, relatively flat, so much easier to build on flat land than it is on a slope. And as we know, our volcanic mountainous countries don't have much flat land because the mountains start very close to the shoreline. That's one reason why they are in demand for development. And another reason is that because they fall below the high water mark. The tenure is, they actually belong to the state and not to communities in most cases, and it's relatively easy to get what they call a foreshore lease over these areas, whereas if they were on communal land it may be more complicated to negotiate lease arrangements. So those are two of the main reasons I think that we find that mangroves are increasingly under threat, and we need to really be on our guard to make sure the appropriate protections mechanisms are in place. Another point is that mangroves, they have this ability and this natural trend that they move with the coastline. As the coastline changes over time, it can extend further seaward, it can extend further landward, depending on the current and presiding climatic conditions. And mangroves are able to move with that coastline. And we need to make sure that we factor that into our planning. So, for instance, when we locate hard infrastructure within mangrove areas, for instance a road, we may block the ability of that mangrove to move further inland and to adapt to changing environmental conditions. We may also be cutting off connectivity between the part of the mangrove behind the road and the part of mangrove in front of the road, particularly if we don't pay enough attention to drainage, to putting in proper drainage facilities to ensure that the two now separated ecosystems remain linked, at least with freshwater and seawater supply. So these are important considerations. Connectivity being one, making sure we understand that and we plan around that. There are dynamic ecosystems, they need to move, and we need to allow them to be able to move. Some other threats, I guess, are cyclones. Mangroves are susceptible where they are in the direct path of a very strong cyclone. They can be damaged, but they have a much better chance of quick recovery if before the cyclone they were already in a healthy condition, which applies to all ecosystems. The healthier they are before the extreme event, the better they are able to recover. And of course, solid waste can be another threat to mangroves. As was the case with coral rehabilitation, and I guess any ecosystem rehabilitation program, you need to treat it as a full-on project and do all the necessary steps that are required when designing a project and implementing a project. Go through the various phases, the project planning phase, the project implementation phase, and the project monitoring and evaluation phase. This is to ensure that you have the greatest chance of success in your project. So good not to take shortcuts, but to really make sure you follow all these steps religiously as far as possible. And there is further technical information in each particular step in the accompanying guide to this slide. I encourage you to have a look at that. I just wanted to share with you this mangrove planting handbook, which is a great resource, which was released, well, I see it's 2 years ago now, but relatively recently. Its setting is Papua New Guinea, but you'll find that it applies to most Pacific Island countries, particularly Melanesian countries. So, a really good resource, a lot of technical detail. Have a look at that. Have a look at that one. Quickly then, just when it comes to actual planting of mangroves, it's not really a case of just always putting them into vertical strips or horizontal strips. There are other designs that you can employ, such as a V shape, where the point of the V is facing the ocean and the wave energy. So this gives them a better chance to survive, because these mangroves down the side of the V are not exposed to as much wave energy. Kind of a streamline, just like a flock of geese would be when they fly through the air. Another way would be doing cluster planting like this. So all this kind of technical information is provided in the guides. All right, those were the three options. Now, just to sum up, we're going to look at some of the principles and challenges involved in doing EbA in coastal marine areas. Well, one of the key principles is managing for change and for uncertainty, which means we've got to really employ an adaptive management approach, right? So make sure we have a strong monitoring system, we have indicators in place that we can actually check on changes as they're happening over time, and we can revisit our management strategies and actions to accommodate any changes that are happening. We need to focus on connectivity, not only between the services that these ecosystems provide and livelihoods and economies, those are linkages and connectivity, but also between the habitats and ecosystems themselves. As you mentioned, ridge to reef, making sure that we understand connectivity between land uses in upland terrestrial areas and how they impact on freshwater systems, which in turn impact are discharged into the sea and impact on coastal ecosystems. And even within the coastal waters, we need to look at connectivity that relates to the life cycle of different marine organisms to make sure that they are linked, and our management interventions make sure that this provision is made to accommodate those life cycle stages of different marine organisms. We need to prioritize ecosystem services that build resilience to and mitigate climate change. We need to maximize co-benefits. We need to make sure that there's community buy-in and active participation in the process, without which it's really unlikely that we're going to have success in our EbA projects. I think I've explained that point. But of course we have challenges, and we're going to be aware of them, and we're going to try and address them in the local context, as well as the national context, but specifically at our particular sites. We need to make sure that we try and address these as best we can. So one of the challenges is this continued ad hoc and fragmented coastal and marine planning, where different sectors are doing different things. They can actually be contradictory. Activities of one sector might be impacting negatively on another sector. Sometimes land uses in a coastal area are not coordinated, and we have a negative synergies between these different kinds of land uses. We need to address these, make sure that our planning is integrated and coordinated. So this fragmented planning can lead to competing interests, and we're going to make sure that we're prepared to accept trade-offs when we do integrated planning. There are always going to be winners and losers, and we have to accept this. And for the losers, we have to try as best as possible to introduce some sort of compensation, maybe tax breaks for them to relocate to other areas. or incentives for them to relocate, if that's the case. We have a weekly developed policy context for management and conservation of blue-green ecosystems, as they're alternatively referred to. This is changing. It's good to see. A lot of progress is being made with regard to marine spatial planning, a lot of interest in developing blue-green economies. So as a result of this, governments are becoming more aware and more interested in better protecting and managing these ecosystems for the benefits they provide, also in terms of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So there's a window of opportunity to start strengthening this policy context. Financing, these things cost money. I mentioned sustainable financing previously. It's a checkbox that we need to address in our program design. We need to make sure we use spatial planning tools to make sure that our planning is area-based and spatial-based and not really just hypothetical and in the air. We need to make sure there's coordination between agencies, and we need to address this issue of lack of awareness amongst stakeholders about the important role that some of these coastal marine ecosystems play in terms of the services they provide to livelihoods and to economies and for climate change adaptation. Last slide, some of the actions that are needed. I think you may be aware of these, but we'll run through them. We need awareness raising at all levels, not just at the community level, but all stakeholders that are involved, including private sector and government at higher levels, need to be aware of the important role played by these ecosystems. We need to review and tighten our policy and legislation, particularly for mangrove, coral reef and seagrass conservation. They're often not really afforded the kind of legal protection that they require. We need to make sure that we mainstream EbA concepts like ecosystem-based management, rich to reef, blue carbon, marine spatial planning, etc., into relevant policies, which would be climate change policies and plans, disaster risk management, risk reduction, even national development and sector policies and plans. All need to make reference to ecosystem-based adaptation and make sure they take an ecosystem-based management approach to their particular sectoral policies and plans. We need to try and make sure that ecosystem values are better integrated into national accounting processes. There have been a lot of studies in recent years and more interest in doing what they call ecosystem valuations to actually start putting monetary value to these services, and more and more data is becoming available about those monetary values of coastal marine ecosystem services. This is allowing us to do economic analyses such as cost-benefit analysis, which helps us to make better decisions in terms of whether it's worthwhile to invest in certain projects or not. And ultimately, there's a need to find ways of better integrating these values into national accounting processes, such as gross domestic product estimates, etc. We need to strengthen coordination between land and sea resource management agencies and promote integrated planning and programming. Spoken about that. Not easy to achieve, but really, really important if we want to afford these ecosystems the protection they need. And it also requires taking a more holistic kind of approach to planning. We need to increase budget allocations, and this is also in recognition of the growing importance of these ecosystems. So the more advocacy we do with high-level decision makers, the better. They need to understand why these ecosystems are really important, particularly in the context of climate change. And once they realize and accept this importance, we're more likely to see increasing budget allocations for their management and protection and rehabilitation. We need to look at promoting public-private community partnerships. there's a lot more that the private sector could be doing in supporting conservation and restoration initiatives, particularly tourism sector, given that they rely directly on the health of these ecosystems as part of their tourism product. So they have an incentive to get involved and to partner with communities and government in supporting EbA programs. Also waste management companies, companies that pollute rivers, etc. They all need to try and bring them on board. And we need to look at various instruments and levers to do that. And those could include tax breaks, other kinds of incentives, biodiversity offsetting, etc. All kinds of instruments that are being developed that can help incentivize participation of private sector in these programs. And I guess that's the last point, really, looking at incentives. Even for communities, there's a need to incentivize them to get more involved. And for example, in Fiji, there's been an introduction of a new kind of land lease on customary land, and that's called the conservation lease. So this now makes it possible for people who are interested to conserve particular areas, and often these are NGOs, and sometimes trust funds are set up. They're able to lease these areas from communities under the conservation lease, whereby communities get a certain amount of royalties if they leave, if they manage their land use in these areas or restrict their land use. So, for instance, they leave native intact forests in place and don't convert to agricultural land. That should be one of the conditions of a conservation lease. There are a couple of examples of these in Fiji that are now happening, and it may be a good model for replication in other countries. All right, that's pretty much it for this sub-module. I hope that you found it useful and that it hasn't piqued your interest in this particular area of ecosystem-based adaptation, planning and implementation. And I encourage you to read the associated notes and resources and references that have been provided, which provide a lot more detailed technical information. Thank you very much, and have a good day.